The woman's hand trembled slightly as she poured champagne into the crystal flute, her polished smile masking the unease she felt. Across the aisle, every other first-class passenger had already been served, except for the quiet black couple in seats 2A and 2B. The man's posture was calm, controlled, but his eyes, those eyes, told a story of patience stretched thin. The woman beside him adjusted her cream-colored jacket, keeping her dignity intact while the flight attendant turned away, pretending not to notice their empty tray tables. At 30,000 feet, where everyone was supposed to be equal in the sky, the quiet tension between rows was louder than any engine roar. You could almost feel it. The unspoken message that comfort and respect weren't distributed evenly, even here, in the luxury of first class. The man leaned slightly toward his wife, whispering something only she could hear. She smiled faintly, though it didn't reach her eyes. Moments later, her finger pressed the call button for the third time. The flight attendant ignored it. And that's when the real story began. He wasn't just another passenger, and she wasn't just another wife asking for a drink. The two of them had the power to shake the entire airline industry to its core. They just hadn't revealed who they were yet. If you've ever seen or experienced discrimination while traveling, you'll want to stay for this one. Drop in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button to join our growing community, because the more we share these stories, the harder they become to ignore. It started hours earlier, on a warm afternoon at Phoenix Sky Harbor International Airport. Isaiah Washington adjusted his navy blue tie, a quiet symbol of pride earned over decades. He wasn't the kind of man who liked to flaunt authority. Years of working for the Federal Aviation Administration had taught him that real power often speaks softly. His wife Zoe walked beside him, her cream suit glowing against her deep skin tone. She held her boarding pass like it was a small reward for the many years they'd spent working behind the scenes of air travel, inspecting planes, auditing safety procedures, holding airlines accountable. Today, they weren't inspectors. They were parents on their way to see their daughter graduate from Howard University, an achievement that meant more to them than any professional milestone. It was supposed to be a trip of joy, of celebration, of quiet gratitude for how far they'd come. But prejudice doesn't check its bags at the counter. When they approached the first-class check-in desk, the attendant didn't even look up at first. Her tone was polite, but sharp enough to cut. "Economy check-in is just across the terminal," she said. Isaiah smiled, the kind of smile you give when you've had this conversation too many times before. "We're in first class," he replied, handing over their tickets and IDs. Her eyes flicked up, and for a brief second, her expression faltered. Then, with forced professionalism, she typed something into her computer. "Of course," she muttered, sliding their boarding passes across the counter. "Enjoy your flight." The words carried no warmth. Zoe caught her husband's hand as they walked away, whispering, "Just breathe. Today's supposed to be about Jasmine." He nodded. They'd made an unspoken promise before the trip. No work talk, no inspections, no pointing out violations. Just a normal flight like everyone else. But habits are hard to silence. As they passed through the priority security lane, Isaiah couldn't help noticing details. The way a baggage handler improperly secured a luggage cart, a fuel truck idling too close to the aircraft. Years of observation didn't turn off easily. Still, he pushed those thoughts aside. This wasn't work, this was family. They arrived at Gate 42, where the Boeing 787 gleamed outside the window. As the boarding announcement played, Isaiah smiled. 20 years in aviation, he said softly, and I still get excited seeing one of these. Zoe chuckled, touching his arm. That's why Jasmine loves this field. She got it from you. Boarding began, and for a brief moment, everything felt normal. The scent of new leather seats, the hum of the jet bridge, the sound of boarding passes scanning. But when they stepped into the cabin, that familiar shift happened again. The subtle change in tone, the hesitation in a stranger's smile. "Seats 2A and 2B, the flight attendant said, her grin tight and practiced. "To your left." Her politeness was mechanical. The warmth she'd given the passengers ahead of them evaporated. As Isaiah stored their carry-ons, Zoe noticed how her hand trembled slightly, not from fear, but from something deeper. A quiet knowing. They had worked their entire lives, ensuring people like this woman could do their jobs safely. Yet, even here after years of service, they were being reminded they didn't fully belong. Isaiah took his seat beside her, exhaling slowly. "Let's just relax," he said. "We earned this." Zoe nodded, though her eyes lingered on the attendant, who was now pouring champagne for every passenger but them. 10 minutes passed. Their glasses remained empty. The seatbelt sign flickered off, the cabin lights dimmed, the hum of quiet laughter floated from across the aisle. Isaiah reached for the call button. A soft chime echoed through the cabin. The flight attendant looked up and deliberately turned away. Zoe's jaw tightened. Did she just? Isaiah placed a steady hand on her arm. "Let's stay calm," he murmured. But calm wouldn't last long, because in just a few minutes, that same flight attendant would accuse them of being disruptive passengers. And the captain, without knowing who they truly were, would make the worst decision of his career. The cabin hummed with a soft rhythm, the low murmur of conversations, the shuffle of designer shoes against carpet, the faint clink of real glassware. The Washingtons settled into their first-class seats, grateful for a rare moment to simply be travelers, not inspectors, not regulators, not symbols of anything beyond a couple on their way to celebrate their daughter's success. Isaiah leaned toward the window, his hand brushing Zoe's. "Feels different sitting up here," he murmured, smiling faintly. "For once, we're not checking safety manuals or monitoring flight logs, just flying." Zoe chuckled. "You earned this, baby. 20 years of red-eye inspections, sleeping in terminals, and arguing with pilots over compliance reports. This is your champagne moment." But champagne, it turned out, wasn't meant for everyone. When flight attendant Meredith Parker approached their row, her smile dimmed like a light losing power. She'd just finished serving the couple across the aisle. A white husband and wife, their glasses gleaming with golden bubbles. "Good afternoon, Mr. and Mrs. Davenport," Meredith had said warmly. "We'll be pouring the vintage before takeoff." Then she turned. "Your beverages?" Her tone shifted, stripped of melody, hollow. Zoe looked up with polite calm. "Sparkling water, please," Isaiah added. "And for me, just orange juice, thank you." Meredith nodded briskly, returned minutes later, and set down 2 plastic cups. The faintest smirk crossed her lips before she moved on. Zoe glanced at her cup, then at the glassware glittering around them. "Plastic," she whispered. Isaiah's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed even. "Let it go. We're here to celebrate, not to be tested." Yet the test had already begun. When the seatbelt light went off, Meredith circulated through the cabin again, chatting easily, refilling wine for some, unfolding linen napkins for others. The Washington's call button, glowing softly above their seats, went unnoticed. Then ignored. Then unacknowledged altogether. Zoe pressed it again. A minute passed, then 3. The light stayed on, unanswered. Isaiah watched the steady pulse of the light and said quietly, "This isn't new." Zoe tilted her head, curious. "It starts small," he continued, "a look, a tone, a hesitation. We've written entire reports about these things in other forms, safety biases, hiring biases. They just wear different uniforms up here." She sighed. "And when you call it out, you're making a scene." Across the aisle, Meredith was laughing with another passenger, her voice rich with warmth again. She turned, caught Zoe's gaze, and for a split second, their eyes locked. Something cold flickered behind that professional mask. Not open hatred, but the practiced indifference of someone who believed kindness was conditional. Zoe turned away first, whispering, "Kindness poured like champagne for some, withheld like rations for others." The plane began to taxi, and Isaiah reached over, lacing his fingers through hers. "Keep your peace," he murmured. "We'll toast to our daughter soon enough." As the engines roared and the aircraft lifted from the ground, the cabin tilted. And so did the mood. The Washingtons sat upright, backs straight, their silence speaking louder than any confrontation could. But under that calm exterior, something simmered. Every small slight carried weight. The way Meredith's tone brightened for others, the way she reached across Isaiah to serve a man behind him without a word of apology. Racism, Zoe thought, didn't always arrive in shouting matches or slurs. Sometimes it hid in politeness that froze you out instead of welcoming you in. When Meredith finally returned near cruising altitude, she leaned in toward Zoe's row, her tone all efficiency. "Lunch options are chicken or pasta. We're out of the special entrees." Zoe noticed the man behind her being offered a choice that included salmon. "Pasta's fine," she said, her voice steady, though her stomach nodded. Meredith placed the tray, nodded curtly, and moved on. Isaiah didn't touch his food. He simply looked at his wife and whispered, "It's always in the little things." Zoe nodded slowly. Little things that tell you how big the problem still is. The plane sliced through clouds, sunlight flooding through the window, a cruel contrast to the quiet storm between seats 3A and 3B. Neither of them spoke for the rest of the meal. But as the aircraft climbed higher, both of them felt it. A shift in altitude that had nothing to do with air pressure. Something in this flight was about to cross a line. And when it did, there would be no mistaking the difference between service and humiliation. The air inside the cabin had settled into that strange quiet that comes after the meal service. Trays cleared, lights dimmed, passengers scrolling on screens or lost in thought. Zoe reached to set her cup down, but the tray table in front of her wobbled sharply, tilting to one side. Her drink nearly spilled across her lap. She steadied it quickly, inspecting the hinge. One side of the locking arm hung loosely, the latch only half engaged. Years of working in aviation safety had trained her eyes to catch such things. It wasn't just inconvenient, it was unsafe. She pressed the call button. No response. Across from her, Isaiah looked up from a book. "What's wrong?" "Tray table's loose," Zoe said. "Could hit someone if we hit turbulence." He nodded slowly. "Then you know what you have to do." The words weren't a challenge. They were a reminder. They'd both spent decades reminding others that small problems become big ones in the air. When Meredith appeared minutes later, her posture carried the same stiff professionalism as before. "Yes, ma'am," Zoe gestured calmly. "This tray's unstable. I just wanted to let you know. It should probably be checked or locked before service continues." Meredith glanced at it with barely a second's attention. "It's fine. Some of them are a little loose on this model." Zoe met her eyes. "It's more than a little loose. I'd recommend marking it unserviceable." Meredith's smile thinned. "We can't just mark things, ma'am. If it bothers you, you can keep it closed." Zoe blinked. "This isn't about comfort, it's a safety issue." Meredith exhaled sharply, her voice dropping half an octave. "I said it's fine." Then, quieter, but pointed, "You don't need to tell me how to do my job." Isaiah looked up from his seat, his tone even but edged with authority. "She's not trying to tell you how to do your job. She's an FAA safety inspector. She knows what a compromised latch looks like." A flicker of something, irritation, maybe embarrassment, passed over Meredith's face. "I'll let the chief attendant know," she said curtly, retreating down the aisle. Zoe sat back, her pulse steady but rising. "See? That tone right there," she whispered. "The minute you assert anything, even facts, you're suddenly difficult." Isaiah nodded quietly. "It's a script they've rehearsed for years." A few minutes later, Chief Attendant Trevor Blake approached. He was tall, with a clipped, formal air that screamed hierarchy. His badge gleamed, his smile didn't. "Good afternoon," he began, voice smooth but cool. "I understand there's a concern about a tray table?" "Yes," Zoe replied calmly. "It's not locking properly. I wanted to bring it to your attention." Trevor leaned over, jiggled the table with a few casual taps, then straightened up. "Seems fine to me." "It's not," Zoe said. "It's moving laterally. The hinge isn't secure." "That's—" "Ma'am," he interrupted, voice firm. "If it were unsafe, we wouldn't let passengers sit here. You're fine." Isaiah's tone sharpened, though his words stayed measured. "With respect, sir, that's not how inspection works. We're not here to argue. She's just alerting you to a potential hazard." Trevor's smile hardened. "Sir, I understand your concern, but we handle our own safety checks. You can relax." The words, "you can relax," landed like a slap, not loud but demeaning. Zoe's fingers tightened around her seatbelt. She could feel eyes turning from nearby passengers, curious glances watching the exchange. The fear wasn't just about being ignored. It was about being labeled. The angry black woman stereotype lurked like a shadow in every interaction, ready to twist her calm logic into defiance. She forced her voice steady. "I'm not upset, I'm being clear. That table could injure someone if—" Trevor's smile vanished. "Ma'am, please stop raising your voice." Zoe's breath caught. She hadn't raised her voice at all. But that phrase, those 5 words, were meant to redefine her tone in everyone else's ears. Isaiah sat forward now, his voice low but resonant. She's not raising her voice. She's addressing a legitimate concern. We both work in aviation. You'd know our names if you've ever read your department's compliance memos. Trevor blinked, his mask slipping for a moment. The Washingtons weren't just passengers. They were part of the very system that governed flight safety, and his casual arrogance had just collided with accountability. Still, he straightened, tone clipped. I'll make a note of it. He turned and walked away. Zoe stared after him, her heartbeat loud in her ears. A note, she murmured. That's their version of sweeping things under the rug. Isaiah leaned closer, whispering, let him write his note. The sky has a way of revealing who's really in control. For the rest of the flight, no one returned to check on them. Their call light stayed dark, their tray remained crooked, and the silence around them grew heavier than the air at 30,000 feet. Somewhere between courtesy and contempt, a line had been crossed. And when turbulence hit, even a small one, the faulty tray table would prove exactly how right Zoe had been. The seatbelt sign blinked on again, though the air was still. A few rows ahead, Meredith whispered something to Trevor, both glancing toward the Washingtons with the kind of look that never needed words. It was the look of people convinced that confidence from the wrong skin tone was defiance. Moments later, Trevor disappeared behind the cockpit door. The lock clicked and whispers rippled through the cabin. Zoe stared out the window, her reflection staring back, composed, restrained, yet burning inside. When the door reopened, Captain Miles Bradshaw stepped out. He was tall, his crisp white uniform almost glowing beneath the overhead lights. His tone, however, carried none of that polish. "Which passengers?" he asked, his voice flat. Trevor pointed discreetly. "Seats 3A and 3B. The captain nodded, then approached, slow, deliberate, each step heavy with authority. The kind of authority that didn't ask questions, it just decided. "Sir, ma'am," he began, "I understand there's been some disruption here?" Zoe blinked, confused. "Disruption?" Isaiah straightened, calm but firm. "There's been no disruption, Captain. My wife pointed out a faulty tray table. That's all." The captain's gaze flicked to Meredith, who stood behind him, arms folded, expression painted in practiced distress. "My crew informs me that you've been confrontational and disrespectful," he said evenly. Zoe's voice trembled, not from fear but from disbelief. "Confrontational? I asked about a broken latch." "You raised your voice," Meredith added quickly. "I didn't," Zoe replied, her voice still soft. Captain Bradshaw raised a hand, cutting through her words. "I'm not here to debate. My responsibility is to maintain order, on board. If my crew feels threatened, I take it seriously." Isaiah exhaled slowly. "Threatened, Captain? We've both worked in aviation safety for over 20 years. We know exactly what order means. What we don't understand is how reporting a hazard became a disciplinary issue." The captain's expression hardened. "Sir, if you're suggesting my crew is lying—" "I'm suggesting they're wrong," Isaiah interrupted calmly. That single interruption was enough. Bradshaw's jaw clenched. "That's enough," he said coldly. "You've both made my crew uncomfortable. For the remainder of this flight, I'll be relocating you to economy. You can discuss any concerns with ground staff after landing." For a moment, silence swallowed the entire first-class cabin. The air grew heavy, not from turbulence but tension. Zoe stared at him, frozen. "You're moving us? For asking about safety?" The captain didn't answer. Instead, he turned to Trevor. "Escort them." Isaiah stood slowly, buttoning his jacket, his dignity unshaken even as the humiliation pressed in. "You're making a mistake, Captain." Bradshaw's reply was sharp. "No, sir, I'm preventing one." The words cut deeper than the action itself. As Zoe rose, the cabin seemed to shrink. Every eye was on them, some pretending not to look, others too eager to. Phones shifted in hands, subtle and secret. A few passengers, aware of the injustice, angled their cameras discreetly. Others sipped their wine and looked away. Nia's voice carried softly through the narration. The walk of shame down that narrow aisle felt longer than the flight itself, not because of distance but because of what it meant, to be seen, yet unseen, judged, yet unheard. Zoe followed behind Isaiah, clutching her handbag to her chest as the whispers trailed after them. A woman in 2C mouthed sorry as they passed. Another man pulled his feet aside, as if their very presence might inconvenience him. Trevor led them past the drawn curtain into economy, where the air was warmer, tighter, less forgiving. "These seats," he said curtly, pointing to two separated spots, 19A and 23C. "Please remain seated for the rest of the flight." Zoe's voice cracked slightly. "We can't even sit together?" "Those are the only available seats," he replied without meeting her eyes. Isaiah placed a hand on her arm. "It's all right," he murmured. "Stay calm, we'll handle it later." But Zoe's composure trembled as she sank into the narrow seat by the window. Around her, strangers avoided her gaze, unsure whether to offer comfort or distance. The hum of the engines seemed louder here, or maybe it was the silence that made it ring. "Silence," Nia narrated softly, "is the oldest form of agreement. Not everyone who watches injustice agrees with it, but too many prefer not to interfere with it." From across the cabin, Isaiah caught Zoe's eyes. Between them passed an understanding that needed no words, the exhaustion of reliving what they had both spent their careers fighting. The flight continued, but the atmosphere had shifted entirely. Every minor announcement now sounded condescending. Every glance from the crew was laced with unspoken judgment. When Meredith passed by, she didn't look at Zoe at all. She just straightened a blanket on another passenger's lap and smiled. The same warm, selective smile that had vanished hours ago. Zoe leaned her head against the cold window and whispered to herself, "Procedure, that's what they'll call it." And she was right. On paper, it would read as standard procedure for managing difficult passengers. But in the sky that day, everyone knew what it truly was: punishment dressed as professionalism. And for Isaiah and Zoe Washington, the altitude had never felt lower. The cabin lights dimmed again, signaling quiet hours. But there was no quiet in Isaiah's mind. He sat wedged between two strangers, a man who'd fallen asleep before takeoff, and a woman scrolling through photos of her beach vacation, while his thoughts replayed the captain's words on a loop. "Disruptive. Making my crew uncomfortable." That phrase had been used against men like him his whole life. Calm in his tone, measured in his actions, but somehow always too much. He exhaled slowly and tried to ground himself. The faint clatter from the galley caught his attention, a metallic clang followed by muffled laughter. Isaiah craned his neck slightly and saw the source. Two attendants had left a galley cart unlocked, its wheels unbraked, rolling lazily back and forth as the plane tilted slightly. His stomach tightened. Unsecured equipment in turbulence? That's a lawsuit waiting to happen. He pressed the call button. Once, twice. No one came. He waited, then pressed it again, his patience thinning. When Meredith finally appeared, her smile was so tight it might have cracked. "Yes, sir?" Isaiah kept his voice calm. "That cart by the galley, it's unsecured. It's moving with the cabin angle. You should lock it before." "We have it under control," she cut in quickly, glancing toward the cart as if realizing for the first time that he was right. She braked it with her foot, locking it silently. "Thank you," she added flatly, and turned away before he could respond. He leaned back in his seat, jaw set. "Under control," he muttered. "Always under control, until it's not." Across the cabin, Zoe sat near the aisle, her gaze flicking toward first class. She could still see the faint outline of the curtain that had separated them. Every so often, a familiar laughter rose from behind it, the comfortable sound of those still enjoying the privileges she and her husband had been denied. Then, from a few rows ahead, a new sound broke through. The voice of another passenger, soft but strained. "I asked for water over 20 minutes ago," said a young black man in a denim jacket, his tone polite but weary. "Everyone else got theirs." The same attendant who'd ignored her earlier gave a quick dismissive nod. "We're busy right now. You'll get it soon." Zoe's chest tightened. There it is again. That pattern, the tone, the selective kindness, the quiet exclusion, wasn't unique to her or Isaiah. It was a language only some passengers seemed to hear. When the attendant moved on, Zoe caught the young man's eyes. He looked back, a brief moment of shared recognition passing between them, that unspoken connection between strangers who've learned to brace themselves for the same kind of storm. "It's a strange kind of fire," Nia's voice narrated, "the kind that doesn't burn outward but builds quietly inside." Somewhere between humiliation and justice, a switch flipped inside them. Isaiah's mind raced through everything he'd witnessed. The faulty tray table, the dismissive captain, the unsecured equipment. He'd filed hundreds of safety reports in his career, some ignored, some acted upon. but never one born out of this kind of personal degradation. He reached into his carry-on and retrieved his FAA identification card, tracing the embossed seal with his thumb. He wasn't just a passenger. He was someone with authority. Someone who could make sure this wasn't forgotten once the wheels touched the ground. He glanced toward the rear galley where a discreet, plain-clothed man sat near the emergency exit. Average build, no uniform, just alert eyes scanning the cabin periodically. Isaiah had noticed him earlier. Every experienced flyer knew the signs: posture too disciplined, gaze too intentional. The air marshal. Isaiah stood slowly and approached him when the aisle cleared. "Excuse me," he said quietly, flashing his credentials just enough for the man to see. "Inspector Isaiah Washington, FAA Safety Division. I need a moment of your time." Dominic Reed's expression didn't change, but his eyes sharpened. "FAA," he murmured. "This about the disturbance in first class?" Isaiah's lips curved in a restrained half-smile. "That's part of it, but there's more. Your crew has been ignoring clear safety violations, unsecured carts, faulty tray mechanisms, and discriminatory handling of passengers. I'm requesting you document this." Reed's gaze flicked forward toward the front of the plane, then back to Isaiah. "I've been observing," he said quietly, "and yes, I've noticed inconsistencies." Isaiah nodded once. "Good, because this doesn't end when we land. My wife and I have spent our lives fighting for safer skies, for everyone. But tonight, it's not just the equipment that's broken." Reed's eyes softened slightly. "Understood. I'll file my own report." Isaiah returned to his seat, exhaling deeply. The woman beside him shifted slightly, sensing the weight in his silence. Across the aisle, Zoe turned, catching his eye once again. He gave a subtle nod, not reassurance, but resolve. Something had changed, Nia's voice continued. They weren't just passengers anymore, they were witnesses, and witnesses have power, especially when silence has overstayed its welcome. As the aircraft cruised through dark skies, Isaiah leaned back, his decision already made. The moment they touched down, the world would know exactly how altitude had exposed arrogance, and how two professionals, pushed into humiliation, found the resolve to rise again. The cabin had settled into that eerie quiet that follows a scandal no one wants to claim. Somewhere between clouds and conscience, the truth began to unravel. Isaiah leaned back in his cramped middle seat, the metal armrests biting into his ribs, his jaw set in a kind of silent defiance. Every minute since being demoted from first class had been a war between his professionalism and his pride. But when the beverage cart rolled by, unsecured, wobbling dangerously as turbulence brushed the plane, his restraint found its limit. He signaled discreetly to the man seated 2 rows up, the air marshal he'd recognized an hour ago by posture alone. Dominic Reed wasn't hard to spot if you knew what to look for. Alert eyes, deliberate calm, the kind of presence that announced authority without a badge. When Reed approached under the guise of a casual aisle walk, Isaiah's low voice carried the weight of revelation. "Mr. Reed," he began quietly, sliding a leather ID wallet halfway open. "I'm Inspector Isaiah Washington, Federal Aviation Administration. That woman they humiliated is my wife. She's also my co-inspector." The moment hung like static. Reed's eyes narrowed as the insignia caught the light, official, unforgeable. His demeanor shifted instantly from watchful neutrality to sharp, controlled purpose. "Say that again?" he asked, just to be sure. Isaiah met his gaze squarely. "You heard me." Within moments, Reed excused himself and strode to the cockpit. The tension in the air was palpable. Nia, narrating from her separate seat, recalled, "I didn't know what was being said behind that locked door, but I could feel the tremor in the air, like the plane itself knew truth had finally boarded." The door opened. The captain, Miles Bradshaw, stepped out, his face ashen under the cabin lights. Passengers stirred, sensing a shift in the hierarchy. The man who had, minutes ago, declared the Washingtons disruptive, now looked like someone who had just seen the ghost of his own career. Air Marshal Reed's voice carried through the cabin with deliberate calm. "Captain Bradshaw, with all due respect, you've made a serious procedural error. These 2 passengers are senior FAA safety inspectors, currently under assignment. Their mistreatment and forced seat downgrade constitute not only misconduct, but also a breach of federal protection protocol." The murmurs began instantly, soft, incredulous gasps. A few phones tilted upward again, recording. But this time the lens pointed at authority itself. Nia's narration sharpened with quiet fury. Suddenly, the silence of authority became the sound of panic. The same people who'd watched us shrink into our seats now leaned forward, not out of sympathy, but out of fascination. Racism had been caught midair, stripped of its camouflage. Captain Bradshaw stammered, his authority unraveling. I wasn't informed. This was protocol. Reed cut him off. Protocol doesn't include humiliation, sir. It includes verification. Isaiah stood, not with rage, but with composure owned from years of commanding respect through calm. All I asked for, he said evenly, was to be treated as any other passenger would, or at least as any white passenger would. That line struck through the cabin like lightning. Even those pretending to scroll on their phones looked up. Orders came swiftly after that. The captain, pale and trembling, instructed the lead attendant to restore the Washingtons to their original seats. But the victory wasn't sweet, not yet. When the attendant approached Zoe, who had been silently watching from a few rows back, her expression didn't soften. She glanced at Nia, then Isaiah. Her voice was steady. With respect, Captain, I'm not moving until the violations are documented. The unsecured galley carts, the unattended exit rows, the procedural neglect. Bradshaw blinked, visibly flustered. Ma'am, you can't just— She can, Reed interjected, and she's right. A hush fell over the cabin again. Not the silence of complicity this time, but of reckoning. Nia, narrating, captured it perfectly. There's a kind of quiet that follows humiliation, but another that follows justice warming its hands. It doesn't roar. It waits. Isaiah retrieved a small notepad from his jacket, the same one used for official in-flight audits. He began jotting notes with the deliberate patience of a man who understood the weight of documentation. Zoe followed suit. Every lapse, every misconduct, every racial inflection disguised as procedure. When the captain attempted to offer an apology, it was too late. His words fluttered weakly against the solid wall of accountability. By the time the Washingtons stood to return to their first-class seats, it wasn't a reinstatement. It was a reckoning, witnessed, recorded, and soon to be reported. Passengers now avoided eye contact, unsure whether to clap, whisper, or shrink. A few who had filmed earlier tried to delete their footage. Guilt leaves fingerprints. Nia's closing narration of the chapter carried both dignity and quiet wrath. They thought first class was a privilege, but for us, it had become a battlefield. Not of comfort, but of conscience. And somewhere at 30,000 feet, the sky decided it had seen enough. The aisle cleared. The Washingtons walked back, heads high, not as victims, but as witnesses who had turned humiliation into evidence. And as they settled once again into the leather seats that once symbolized exclusion, the hum of the engines seemed to whisper the truth the world had tried to drown out. Power doesn't always wear a uniform. Sometimes it carries a clipboard and a memory that refuses to fade. The landing gear groaned as the plane descended through the clouds, the hum of the engines swallowed by a silence that wasn't peace. It was anticipation. Every passenger could feel it. This wasn't just another arrival. It was a reckoning wrapped in routine. From her seat, Nia gazed out the window as Washington, D.C. came into view. The marble monuments, the disciplined lines of light along the Potomac, a city that knew how to hide its truths beneath structure. Her voice, calm yet weighted, carried the story's pulse. We were coming home, not just to our city, but to the truth. And this time, truth was landing with us. As soon as the aircraft rolled to a stop at Gate 17, the energy shifted. Air Marshal Reed was already on his phone, briefing airport security and FAA field agents. His tone was low but firm. He wasn't just protecting passengers. He was ensuring accountability took form. When the cabin doors opened, the first thing Isaiah noticed wasn't the usual airport chatter, but the cameras. A quiet cluster of reporters who'd been tipped off by the initial passenger videos that leaked mid-flight. The world was waiting to hear what had happened at 30,000 feet. The Washingtons, however, didn't rush into the limelight. They walked off that plane with the same quiet dignity they had carried throughout. Not vindictive, not boastful, but deliberate. Behind them, the once confident flight attendants avoided their eyes. Meredith, her crisp uniform now a symbol of disgrace, stood pale and speechless. Trevor, who had once smirked in superiority, now struggled to meet anyone's gaze. Naya narrated softly. Justice doesn't always need applause. Sometimes it just needs to be written down. Inside the terminal, a private conference room had been arranged. Reed personally escorted them there. Forms, digital logs, and witness statements were waiting. The Washingtons filed their reports. Factual, professional, detailed. No emotion, no embellishment, just truth, time-stamped and irrefutable. Outside, the press was buzzing. Who are they? Are they suing? What's the FAA's response? By nightfall, Skyline Airways was trending, not for its destinations but for its discrimination. FAA officials had already issued a public statement confirming a full-scale audit into the airline's internal practices and crew conduct. Captain Bradshaw, Meredith, and Trevor were suspended pending investigation. The irony didn't escape Nia. The same people who thought they were protecting order were the ones who violated it. Yet through it all, the Washingtons remained composed. They didn't post statements, didn't celebrate online, didn't relish the fall of others. Their silence wasn't weakness, it was wisdom. Isaiah, standing by the terminal window, said quietly to Naya, "We didn't win anything. We just reminded them of what should have never been forgotten." Nia nodded. Her narration deepened as she reflected on what the ordeal had revealed, not just about racism in the skies, but about resilience on the ground. Power didn't change us, it revealed us. It showed us that our worth was never tied to a seat number, a title, or a uniform's approval. It was always there, waiting to be seen by those who refused to look. They left the airport hand in hand, walking past the flashing cameras, the murmuring crowd, and the flashing lights of official vehicles. Every step was quiet, but it carried a message louder than any press release. That night, as they sat together overlooking the DC skyline from their apartment window, Nia reflected on the journey. Some people fly to escape something, others fly to prove they belong. But for us, that flight was never about distance. It was about truth, and truth doesn't need wings, it needs courage. Then, turning her reflection outward, her voice softened, reaching through the screen to the viewer. If you've ever been underestimated because of your skin, your name, or your silence, remember this: grace can be louder than rage, and sometimes the calmest voice in the room can dismantle the loudest lie. Because the world doesn't change when we shout, it changes when we refuse to sit quietly in the face of wrong. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of a moment when you were judged before you were heard, share your story below. Have you ever faced discrimination in public and chosen grace over anger? Do you think silence in the face of racism helps or harms change? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Let's make this more than a story. Let's make it a conversation that travels farther than any plane ever could.